This is a series showing that coffee was sitting inside the systems that made the American Revolution possible. Trade, taxes, supply chains, public conversation, consumer resistance, and ultimately, American identity. Welcome to Brewing the Revolution.
Hello, Don Kennedy, CEO of Convoy Coffee Roasters, here for our fifth and final episode of Brewing the Revolution, where tea was the system and coffee was the alternative and became the choice that shaped part of our American identity. So in this fifth episode, we're going to talk about what happened after we won the Revolutionary War, because we won and the French went home. They had their own revolution, basically cut off the head of their king. The Brits went home, and it was just us with this American experiment, this new colony cluster of different ideals and different belief systems. And we were going to pull it all together and become a nation. And in order to talk a little bit about the coffee tracing that we have through our own Bill of Rights, we need to go backwards to the sobering of Europe in the 1600s. So I did a prelude episode a while back that talked about the sobering of Europe and the idea that in the 1600s, coffee became widely available, as did tea, in Western Europe. So British were drinking it, the French were drinking it, other countries were drinking non-intoxicating beverages, in some cases largely for the first time. And what this allowed the population to do was to come and gather at coffee houses. And the first coffee houses were actually started in London in the 1650s. I believe the first one's name was David's Coffee House. And that's also very interestingly where some of the trade risk discussions developed Lloyd's of London as an insurance carrier. But beyond that, I do want to go back there and talk about the sobering of Europe and why these coffee houses were so incredibly important to ultimately what we can trace to our First Amendment rights, the rights of free speech and free assembly, freedom of religion. A lot of this started way back then. Why? Well, because people could hold ideas. If they weren't drinking from sunrise to sunset, they could hold conversations. They could read the newspapers, they could publish pamphlets, and they could start to ask those questions. The harder questions, which is, do we have to live this way? What if we did it that way? What if this was different? Do we need a king? And those types of conversations were being held in the coffee houses in London and in England long before they ever came over to the colonies. But in 1675, King Charles II decided that coffee houses in London, they produced, I'm going to read the quote, false, malicious, and scandalous reports against the government. And the coffee houses were considered dangerous rooms and seats of sedition. So he actually attempted to outlaw or make coffee houses illegal in 1675. This was the proclamation of King Charles II. Didn't work, didn't go anywhere. But London coffee houses and that tradition came over to the colonies. Our very first London coffee house opened in Philadelphia back in 1754. So again, as we were talking in earlier episodes about the amount of coffee that was being advertised for sale between the 1760s, 1770s, and ultimately, the growth of coffee here in the colonies, we were already opening those coffee houses and having these additional places to meet and to converse. And it was right next to William Bradford's printing house and bookstore. So when this opened in 1754, the coffee house was right next to the printing press and next to the bookstore. And so these ideas, these deep theoretical, political, social, revolutionary ideas were actually already being held inside the coffee houses in Philadelphia. So it wasn't just Boston. So we win. The Treaty of Paris is in 1783, and the scrappy startup wins the war. So then the question becomes, now what? And we can then talk about the years of discussion around things like federalism and anti-federalism and congressional power versus states' rights. There's a lot of that could be kind of sorted through. But I think the more important thing to talk about was that these discussions became very intense. They became incredibly public and incredibly difficult as far as the viciousness on either side. We did obviously come to an agreement at some point, but these exchanges of ideas between 13 colonies, 13 belief systems, the only thing we really all had in common at that point was we lived on American soil and we threw out the British. So there were a lot of divided ideas that were coming together into this messy sort of American experiment. And the constitutional amendments that became the Bill of Rights. So the National Archive notes that there were originally 12 Bill of Rights amendments that were offered in 1789 on September 25th of 1789. So there were originally 12, not 10. In the very first amendment, this idea of the free speech, free rights of assembly, free political expression, free religious expression, these civic habits, that became part of our Bill of Rights and our American ideals was we don't want the government to tell us what we can think and what we can say. And that traces all the way back to those original coffee houses. And we can point back and look at the tracing of when the British decided that they were going to blockade the ports and they were going to put soldiers in our houses, and everything that the king and parliament did in the prior years before the Declaration were things that we were going to write into our own form of government, that it wasn't going to be tolerated here. And what's really interesting about this is we still don't have this all figured out. I'm recording this in 2026, and we still have all sorts of debates over censorship and sedition. And in fact, the Sedition Act of 1798 was a very first test of whether or not this nation can handle criticism and dissent without making accusations. And that tension is still here today. And again, I would say it goes all the way back to the sobering of Europe and all the way back to coffee being widely available. So let's talk about coffee just as part of our American identity. More people drink coffee in the United States than they do other drinks in the morning. And that habit has continued. Now we also have iced coffees in the afternoon. We have all kinds of coffee recipes that we make for different beverages and things. And coffee has really become a large part of American life. Now, is this to say that we're the only country that makes coffee an identity? No, of course not. We have French drink coffee. Italy drinks coffee, espressos and things. But really, on the American front, what makes our coffee identity so unique is that it was not that coffee was better than tea. It was that we rejected what tea stood for, the system that tea was a part of. And we decided to drink an alternative, anything that was not tea. So here we are in 2026. We are still drinking coffee, the revolution. This year is our 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And it's such a timely reminder that what we make our ordinary daily habit actually came from a lot of struggle, some smuggling, some real judgment against our colonial neighbors who chose tea, and ultimately the scrappy startup who decided that those clear, sober thoughts that started in the 1600s should come over, and after we win the war, should be codified into our American identity. I hope you've enjoyed this series, Brewing the Revolution. And I'm Dawn Kennedy, and I really enjoyed bringing you all of this. I need to remind you again to subscribe and like and share if you enjoyed this video. And I look forward to talking to you again in a future series on coffee and history. Take care.